Be warned, the following video contains footage from the World of Warcraft Legion Alpha. I've done my best to limit the amount of spoilers in this video. We'll be using mostly dungeon footage, but if you wish to turn away now to avoid spoilers, this is your only opportunity. You have been warned.
There is no light, only darkness.
In Legion, all of the classes and specializations will be changing rather dramatically. As a focus is applied towards class fantasy, we'll be gaining and losing abilities, and those that we have are likely going to be changed or tweaked in all kinds of different ways. So, in this series of videos, we'll discuss how each class and spec has changed and what you can expect from it come Legion. Naturally, this is all alpha footage, so things can, and likely will, change before Legion launches in August. Let's start by discussing Blood Death Knights. In Legion, Death Knights have received a large change to how their resources work. Rather than dealing with Blood, Frost, Unholy, and Death runes, all Death Knights, regardless of their specialization, now use the ubiquitous rune as one of their resources. Types of rune don't exist anymore. Essentially, every rune is now a Death rune. Runic power remains mostly unchanged, save for the fact that Death Knights now only have one way of spending runic power outside of using specific talents. With the focus on class fantasy, the Blood Death Knight has lost a lot of non-blood related abilities. They have lost Army of the Dead, Chains of Ice, Dark Simulacrum, Death Coil, Empower Rune Weapon, Frost Presence, Horn of Winter, Icebound Fortitude, Icy Touch, Outbreak, Plague Strike, Soul Reaper, and Unholy Presence. Whilst that might seem like a lot of abilities being removed, the truth of the matter is that these abilities are being divvied up between the Death Knight specializations. That being said, the Blood Death Knight has received some interesting changes that push it in a different direction. Death Strike is still the main spell the Blood Death Knight will want to use, and it still heals for a percentage of damage recently dealt to the Death Knight, but now it consumes 40 runic power rather than costing runes. That means that generating runic power and spending it wisely will be all the more important for a Blood Death Knight wanting to effectively reduce the damage they take. Just like on Live, Death Strike generates a blood shield, and the strength of this shield is affected by the Death Knight's mastery statistic. Bone Shield has also been changed. Now, instead of being an active ability that works as a sort of cooldown, it is a passive. Stacks of Bone Shield will be generated by Marrow Rend, a new ability for the Blood Death Knight. This costs 2 runes, deals single target damage, and grants a few stacks of Bone Shield. While active, Bone Shield reduces all damage taken by 20% and increases the Death Knight's haste, which means they generate runes faster. Taking damage removes a stack of this Bone Shield, which is handily displayed on the Marrow Rend button. This is labelled as active mitigation, so I assume this will count for mitigating certain boss abilities that need active mitigation to be applied. This means that the Blood Death Knight will be spending most of their time maintaining stacks of Bone Shield using Marrow Rend, and spending their runic power on Death Strike to heal themselves. When at full stacks of Marrow Rend, which is 10, the Blood Death Knight has Blood Strike, now renamed to Heart Strike, to fall back on as their rune spender. This hits 2 enemies with damage and reduces their movement speed. Since it only costs 1 rune to Marrow Rend's 2, it's usable more frequently when things are calm, and it works well as a means to grab aggro on extra enemies. It does, however, have an interaction with Death and Decay, which we'll get onto in just a bit. Another new ability that the Blood Death Knight has is Death's Caress. This is a ranged spell that costs 1 rune, deals light shadow damage, and applies Blood Plague to the target. Blood Plague lasts about 24 seconds and slowly drains health from the target. This means that Blood Plague needs to be up at just about all times. It's the only plague that Blood Death Knights need to manage. On that note, Blood Boil is now completely free, and comes with 2 charges, meaning that it's a great filler spell for dealing light area of effect damage and generating threat. But it also applies Blood Plague to everything it hits, meaning that, as it's free, right now you don't really need to use Death's Caress to apply Blood Plague, you can just keep it active with Blood Boil. However, there is a talent that fiddles with this functionality, and we'll discuss that later. Death Grip works just as it did before, but, as a note, although all Death Knights retain this ability, only Blood's Death Grip taunts, so if you see damage-dealing Death Knights gripping, they're not taunting as well. Now, a very nice addition here is that Gorfine's Grasp is no longer a talent, and is available baseline exclusively to Blood Death Knights. This is a fantastic tool for controlling enemies, and only Blood can do it. This brings a lot of value to them as a tank. Anti-Magic Shell remains entirely unchanged, and all 3 Death Knight specializations can use it. Vampiric Blood remains as it was. Only available to Blood Death Knights, it increases maximum health and all healing received during its duration. But it now has a talent that alters its use, which is really cool. Dancing Rune Weapon is, again, unchanged. Only available to Blood Death Knights, it increases your parry chance for a short time and summons a second weapon to copy your abilities. But not the heals you do with Death Strike. Death and Decay remains a very useful means with which to deal AoE damage and generate threat. Crimson Scourge, the passive that grants auto-attacks a chance to make your next Death and Decay, Blood Boil, or Defile free, now only applies to Death and Decay, and requires the target you're auto-attacking to be infected by Blood Plague. But if the Death Knight uses Heartstrike while standing in their own Death and Decay, it will hit all nearby enemies. This not only provides some nice AoE damage, but it's great for getting threat on lots of enemies very quickly. Since Death and Decay also interacts with some talents, this is a very important spell. Strangulate has been somewhat changed as well. Renamed to Asphyxiate, it has a 20-yard range, a 45-second cooldown, costs nothing to cast, and is a simple 5-second stun on a single target. Control Undead remains the same, available to all Death Knights. Raise Ally is similarly unchanged, available to all Death Knights and serving as a combat res. However, it doesn't cost anything now, meaning that it's always available to be used. The Death Knight finally receives some attention to its movement ability with Wraith Walk. If you've played Leoric in Heroes of the Storm, you will be familiar with this ability. With a 1-minute cooldown, this suppresses movement impairing effects and increases your movement speed for a couple of seconds. However, this requires the Death Knight to channel, meaning that using any other ability will cancel Wraith Walk. It's a very useful ability for moving around, picking up extra adds, or just getting to places. Plus, it looks awesome. The main artifact ability for the Blood Death Knight is granted upon initially receiving their artifact, the Maw of the Damned, an axe that feasts on souls. Yum yum. This is called Consumption. With a 45-second cooldown, this ability deals a huge amount of damage to enemies in front of the Death Knight, providing a heal equivalent to double the damage done. This healing does not trigger Blood Shield, but a well-timed Consumption can heal the Death Knight for most of their health. The artifact tree itself is mostly full of passives that increase the Blood Death Knight's ability to tank and deal damage. Heading to the right, we have an increase to physical damage, an enhancement to Vampiric Blood, an increase to Marrowrend's damage, an increase to Bloodplade's damage, and thus healing,
allowing Marrowrend a chance to generate extra bone shield stacks,
an increase in parry chance, and granting Blood Shield 25% leech, allowing for successive Death Strike and Consumption hits to be stronger. Moving the other way down the artifact tree, we have an increase to the duration of Dancing Rune Weapon, an armor increase, an increase to Heartstrike's damage done, and a trait that will make Heartstrike heal the Death Knight for 25% of the damage it deals. This is the only artifact trait that seems to affect how you play, because now you can heal whilst also AoEing, so it may make a Blood Death Knight consider when to use Marrowrend versus Heartstrike against multiple dangerous foes. Moving on, we have an increase to Stamina, a trait that makes Blood Plague grant an absorption shield equal to 5 times the damage it deals during the duration of Vampiric Blood. It takes the name quite literally there. This, again, could be great for AoE situations where you have a lot of Blood Plagues active. This will, however, depend upon how much you use Vampiric Blood. Finally, moving down the tree, we have Mouth of Hell, which makes Dancing Rune Weapon summon a second copy of Maw of the Damned. Since this says a second copy, this means you will summon 2 Dancing Rune Weapons for 3 times the damage. At the bottom of the tree, we have All-Consuming Rot, which increases Death and Decay damage. And finally, Skeletal Shattering, which makes Bone Shield have a chance to critically block an additional 15% of the damage taken whenever it absorbs damage. That's the Maw of the Damned's artifact tree. Okay, moving on to talents. These have all been overhauled as well. Remember, there's no cost for swapping talents right now, so you're encouraged to change them regularly. In an effort to save time, in this video, I'll be providing the tooltips for talents, but only going over my thoughts on them, rather than explaining their intricacies. This isn't a guide, remember. Tier 1. Bloodworms is a fairly strong talent, but it takes time to get them generated, and they're somewhat random. Heartbreaker is my choice at the moment, as it allows for huge amounts of runic power generation while tanking trash, which, in the alpha, can sometimes be quite as nasty as bosses. Exsanguinate is my choice on single target boss fights, especially those where my healer is struggling. It kind of acts as a sort of pseudo cooldown. Tier 2. Rapid Decomposition is my choice here, as I tend to stand in my Death and Decay for Heartstrike's bonuses, and this combines very nicely with Heartbreaker in the last tier. Soul Gorge is quite complex, allowing for a skilled player to generate more runes faster. However, since I was still learning the Blood Death Knight, and I was relying on Blood Boil to apply Blood Plague, I didn't end up using this talent. I imagine skilled players will be using Soul Gorge to carefully increase their rune generation, but for newcomers, you'll probably want to avoid this talent. Spectral Deflection, I found, was never really worth it in dungeons, since most hits are for less than 25% of your maximum health. But in raids, this may have some really great applications for absorbing huge hits. Tier 3. Ossuary, I found, was a great sort of win more spell. If you were doing well with lots of bone shield stacks, then you could death strike much more often. But if you started struggling and getting behind on stacks, this talent in no way helped you. When running easier dungeons or leveling, this talent would likely be fantastic. Blood Tap was my choice here, as it allowed me to generate runes on demand, which meant Marrow Rends on demand. I prefer to be in control as a tank, so this was a natural fit for me. Anti-Magic Barrier, I found, wasn't all that helpful, as I never found myself in a situation where I both needed to absorb a lot of magic damage and increase my maximum health. But it does allow Anti-Magic Shell to have some use in fights where there's no magic damage done, so it does have potential. Tier 4. Mark of Blood was my choice here, especially against bosses that hit particularly fast. You can have multiple marks active, but since it costs 30 runic power, I tend to be careful about overusing it when compared to Death Strike. Red Thirst is another talent that I would use a lot, especially when fighting trash. I found that I could use Vampiric Blood once every 45 seconds or so, which was great because since trash has a lot of health right now and we don't do too much damage, every trash fight is about a minute long. Tombstone I just never used. Just like Ossuary in Tier 3, this feels like a win more spell, requiring high bone shield stacks to gain beneficial effects. Remember that bone shield only stacks up to 10, so this doesn't even generate enough runic power for a single death strike. I never really found it to be worth it. Tier 5. Tightening Grasp was great in dungeons, as there were plenty of times where I'd want to group trash packs up as they stubbornly tried to cast from 3 different directions at once. I never found the movement speed reduction to be helpful, but I can definitely see some of its applications. Tremble Before Me seems very odd, since damage can cancel the effect and it's being applied by a constant ticking damage spell. In a dungeon, I saw basically no use for this. Random stuns on trash packs aren't all that helpful, I've found, compared to coordinated ones, and bosses most likely can't be stunned, so I never really found it useful. March of the Damned does have applications, especially when facing enemies that stun, snare, and root you, but I never really used it that often. Tier 6. Will of the Necropolis, I found, wasn't really that helpful. If I found myself under 35% health, I was usually either going to die, or I was about to heal myself up beyond 35% health. Rune Tap is my choice, as it allows for you to preempt damage taken, generate some runic power, and you can do it fairly frequently. It's really the only controlled damage reduction, flat damage reduction spell that the Death Knight has. Foul Bulwark, again, is a win more spell. I never really found a use for it, but it may have applications in particularly nasty raid fights. Tier 7. Bone Storm was recently changed to cost runic power, and as a result, I never found myself using it. Since it only heals for 1% of maximum health, you'd need to be hitting a lot of enemies for it to be useful, but it does have applications. Blood Mirror, I found, was very helpful during my tanking ventures. Since it redirects damage I take from all sources, rather than just the target's damage, I could use it on trash packs to make the entire affair easier, and naturally it has plenty of applications on hard-hitting bosses too. Finally, Purgatory is back, and it remains as potent as ever. Here's the thing. With the changes to healing, I never found myself using it, as if I got low enough to die, the healer was normally struggling too much to be able to bring me back. This may work better in coordinated dungeon and raid groups, but for pugs, I never really found it to be helpful. Now, let's discuss what the Blood Death Knight is like to play. From my own subjective point of view as a player who hasn't raided as a Blood Death Knight, I have to say it's really quite fun. The basic rotation of applying Blood Plague with either Death's Caress or Blood Boil keeping Bone Shield stacks up with Marrow Rend, generating extra runic power with Heart Strike, then spending it on Death Strike with the occasional consumption thrown in, was very fast-paced and fun. I always felt like I had something to do. My general rotation would be to initiate the fight with either Death Grip or Death and Decay, put down the Death and Decay after I'd done a Death Grip, throw out a Blood Boil to get Blood Plague out, generate a couple of Marrow Rend stacks assuming I didn't have any Bone Shield from the previous trash pack, use Heart Strike and Death Strike kind of on cooldown, and that kind of kept me fine. I'd use Consumption whenever I felt threatened. With Death Grip, Gorfiend's Grip, and Asphyxiate, I felt like I could control enemies no matter the situation. Once they were gathered up, I could throw down a Death and Decay and start generating tons of runic power. Against trash, the Blood Death Knight is really strong, and I never really found myself panicking too much. It's against single bosses that I feel the Blood Death Knight can struggle. With less runic power generation, it becomes harder to Death Strike, and against bosses that hit quickly, Bone Shield becomes extremely difficult to keep up, to the point where I died repeatedly on a particular boss in the Vault of the Wardens, who hit so fast that I could barely keep my Bone Shield stacks active, let alone pull them and focus on other things. I feel that, right now, if the Blood Death Knight is doing well, they're really difficult to kill. But once they start struggling, once they start running out of Bone Shield stacks, they're low on runes, they really struggle to get back. And good coordination with healers here I think will be vital. That said, having a character that can just, heal themselves and keep themselves mostly healthy is really cool. Right now, the Blood Death Knight is in a good place. They have a nice variety of abilities to deal with multiple situations, being it dealing with lots of trash, be it dealing with magic damage, physical damage, having to move a lot, having to move enemies, having to interrupt enemies, having to stun enemies. They have their own brand of control, and they can pretty much deal with almost any situation. Now that only Blood can use Gorfiend's Grasp, it makes them even more enticing to bring to a raid where multiple adds need to be controlled. With the right talents, you can have loads of cooldowns to help survive. Vampiric Blood, Dancing Rune Weapon, Blood Mirror combined with Mark of Blood and Blood Tap for on-demand Marrow Rends, it allows the Death Knight to react quickly to changing situations. I never felt like my tools couldn't handle the situation I was in. Overall, the Blood Death Knight is fun. It's a lot of fun. I would heartily recommend it to players who want to be in control of their own health far more than other tanks are. In terms of difficulty, I would say it's kind of middling to hard difficulty because it plays very differently to other tanks. You have to really watch your own health and figure out when to heal, and you don't really have as many just flat-out damage reduction spells, but you have ways of restoring your health, so your health is going to bounce a lot. If you get scared by losing health, the Blood Death Knight's going to terrify you. The fantasy of ripping bones from your foes, even if they don't have bones, and using them to protect yourself is really cool, and I expect this class to do quite well in the future. I don't really see any glaring issues, but then again, I am not a professional. This is just my thoughts. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, or suggestions, you can contact me using the links in the description, or you can just leave a comment. Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you the best of luck in the world of Warcraft. Vampiric Blood, Dancing Rune Weapon, Blood Mirror combined with Mark of Blood and Blood Tap for on-demand round.